Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. We begin this week's discussion with a discussion of postcolonialism, and today's lecture is titled Situating the Postcolonial in the Postmodern. Keeping in tune with the frameworks that we had been following, it's very important to see the ways in which postmodernism responds to and reacts to the various other kinds of critical frameworks and conceptual ideas which are available in the 20th and the early 21st century. In that context, we begin talking about the postcolonial and the postmodern with the possibility of identifying confluences between the two. Both can be considered as two of the most influential frameworks in the contemporary, and there are also a number of critical theories, literary theories and cultural theories which could be identified as offshoots of these two events, these two phenomena known as postcolonialism and postmodernism. Just like postmodernism, postcolonialism also has a historical positioning, and the postcolonialism is also concerned with specific kinds of artistic and intellectual inquiries, and in that sense we can say that there is a historical provenance within the field of critical theory in the context of both postcolonialism and postmodernism. Many of the issues that we have been highlighting in the context of our discussions of postmodernism could be extended to the discussions related to postcolonialism as well. So we begin this lecture by taking a look at what postcolonial theory is. Pramod Nair very aptly sums up the concepts of postcolonial theory in these words: it is a method of interpreting, reading and critiquing the cultural practices of colonialism, where it proposes that the exercise of colonial power is also the exercise of a racially determined powers of representation. So here some of the terms may look familiar. It's also talking about ways of interpretation, the multiple ways of reading, and also about how postcolonialism gives us a method to critique certain cultural practices which were the result of colonialism. So just like we spoke about how postmodernism was calling for a new kind of interpretive framework away from the ideas of modernity, here we find a theoretical framework in postcolonialism asking us to move away, to depart from the ideals which were propagated and which were legitimized by colonialism. Just like postmodern theories and the postmodern frameworks are based on certain assumptions, postcolonial theory also begins with the assumption that colonial writing, arts, legal systems, science and other sociocultural practices are always racialized, hence unequal, and where the colonial is the representation and the native is represented. So in certain way it's also about subverting the relationship between the colonial and the native. And it also talks about a certain hierarchical relationship, a certain binary representation of the colonial who represents and the native who is represented by the colonial. So postcolonial theory gives us frameworks to reject these binaries, to question these hierarchies and to move away from some of the ways in which colonial writing or colonial art forms have resulted in the subjugation of certain marginalized communities and groups. When we begin talking about postcolonialism, it is only appropriate that we begin with Edward Said and the postcolonial moment that he inaugurated in 1978 with the publication of his work Orientalism. Orientalism in multiple ways, it sums up the essence of postcolonial theory. It also inaugurates the ways in which the post-colonial worlds, the post-colonial nations could write back, to talk back to the empire with a renewed sense of legitimacy. And Edward Said was also publishing his works during the same time when the works of Derrida, Foucault, Althusser and the French feminists were becoming available in the Western academia. He is also said to have inaugurated an intellectual turbulence that altered the shape and canon of Western and Eastern academia. In that sense, just like postmodernism challenged and thwarted many established traditions of culture and literature, postcolonialism also went on to challenge, question and de-establish the many literary and cultural traditions which were in place during the time of colonialism. Among the many things that Edward Said encouraged us to do was to see colonialism as rooted in an epistemological inquiry and project, which the project was constructing the Orient. So through his very influential work Orientalism, he illustrated and argued that the colonial project was also a project through which a certain epistemological understanding, certain knowledge systems about the Orient was getting constructed. So in that sense, we also had, as a result of colonialism, a certain kind of a construction in which the Europe and the Orient operated as binary opposites to each other. So by an extension, looking at the Orient and Europe from such a perspective, it would not be wrong to say that the Orient was constructed in such a place that it figured as a place frozen in time with no progress or change. And in binary opposition, Europe and the many nations and the many communities and the many cultures that it represented, they were also foregrounded as icons of change, as icons of progress. So this kind of Edward Said's post-colonial moment, Edward Said's Orientalism gave us tools to respond to this kind of a figuration of the Orient, in which the Orient was frozen in time without any inkling of progress or any kind of change. If we try to define Orientalism further, it could be defined as a style of thinking, a form of representation that created opinions, ideas and images of the non-European culture in racialized ways. So why was this done? This was done to bring into effect two major things. One, the East was always contrasted negatively with Europe, and secondly, it justified the colonial presence in the East. In this context, we can also recall the phrase white man's burden, which seemed to justify the many things that the colonial masters were doing in various colonies during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. We also now take a very quick look at some of the key concepts and texts which inform the study of post-colonial theory. And some of the terms which are very imperative in our understanding are imperialism and colonial discourse, and this was also used to talk about the literature of the empire. So here we were also given insights into a different kind of literature which was able to talk back to the empire, such as subaltern studies or the literature of the subaltern, and the post-colonialism also gave us a new language to talk about nation, nationalism and even the post-national in the contemporary, and it also gave rise to certain kinds of distinctions within history, where we were also taught in certain ways to respond to a dominant nationalist historiography with the many histories from the margins, with the many histories which were written from below. And it also gave rise to the concepts and definitive meanings associated with it, such as the third world and the third space, or the idea of the diaspora, or the various ways in which certain cultures were seen as cosmopolitan than the other. And there were also particular works which could be identified as seminal to our understanding of post-colonialism, such as Heart of Darkness, which was a very seminal novel which radically redefined the ways in which we think about fiction and the writings from particular nations, and Masks of Conquest by Gauri Vishwanathan, which inquired into the ways in which English education played a very seminal role in altering the phase of modernity in India, and Homi Bhabha's Location of Culture, Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak. These are some of the seminal texts and concepts which were influential in defining and redefining post-colonialism in the 20th century. The objective of this lecture is to foreground certain ways in which post-colonial theories and postmodern theories come together to talk about the contemporary. In that sense, one of the first things that we would be doing is to identify the ways in which postmodernism meets with post-colonialism. So in Roger Berger's words, postmodernism is simultaneously or variously a textual practice, often oppositional, sometimes not, a subcultural style or fashion, a definition of the Western post-industrial cultures, and the emergent or always already dominant global culture. At the same time, post-colonialism is simultaneously or variously a geographical site, an existential condition, a political reality, a textual practice, and the emergent or dominant global culture. So here, we are being drawn into two ways in which one could talk about postmodernism as well as postcolonialism. And here Roger Berger is drawing our attention to how both these phenomena, postmodernism and postcolonialism, could be seen as textual practices, but there are also certain ways in which they diverge. Both are textual practices, and they also examine certain emergent or dominant global cultures. The ways in which they converge does not necessarily mean that they are not essentially different from each other. There are also very particular, very identifiable differences. Post-colonial writings have a geographical nature to them, and they also express an existential condition. In that sense, since they are rooted in particular nations, particular communities, and also they are talk back against certain kinds of projects which were part of the colonial enterprise, they could be considered more of a political movement. And just if we recall some of the discussions that we had in the context of Marxism, feminism and postmodernism, it was also underlined with a lot of emphasis that postmodernism is not a political movement, though there is a certain political element, an ambivalent political element which could be associated with it. So, postmodernism as against postcolonialism is not a political movement, and postcolonial writings, though there are aesthetic and other critical elements associated with it, it could be seen as predominantly a political movement. Postmodernism again is not rooted in a particular location vis-a-vis postcolonial writings which have a geographical nature to them, and postmodernism in that sense could be seen as a literary and cultural movement which would have a more global universal appeal than any kind of rooted literary, cultural or political phenomenon. And how do we mark the boundaries of postcolonialism and postmodernism? So, it is important to locate the ways in which they converge and diverge in order to see how even the points of divergences have certain kinds of similarities in the way in which they diverge. For example, postcolonial writers attempt to unmask European authority, and postmodernism attempts to unmask authority in general. And both in that sense, both postcolonialism and postmodernism, they attempt to investigate the ideas of control in different settings. So, we have also noted in the multiple discussions that we had with respect to postmodernism that there is a way in which postmodern theories, whether they come from artistic frameworks or from political frameworks or from the frameworks related to media, there is a way in which the postmodern theories always challenge all kinds of authority. There is a way in which they also try to move away from the marked ways in which authority had been defined during the modernist tradition, during the time of modernity. Here, once we begin to look at the similarities based on the ideas of authority and control, it also leads us to certain common concepts that postcolonialism and postmodernism share. First of all, they are both engaged with the aspects of language and power. And the way in which postmodernism responds to a linguistic turn, especially at the turn of the post-structuralism, is something that we have noted in the earlier sessions, and we also noted how post-structuralists drew a lot of inspiration from the linguistic turn, where certain discussions related to language and power became very seminal in the understanding of the post-industrial capitalized societies. And here, language and power, they need to be seen at within a larger framework, because they also allow us to reconstruct history and literature through language. The term reconstruction is very important over here, because through language, when it becomes possible to reconstruct history or reconstruct literature, it also gives us a possibility to reconstruct different forms of identity and also to question different kinds of authority. And in these ideas of language, power and the reconstruction through history and literature, they operate to reach a common end. Both desire to bring the marginal to the center in literature as well as in history. To sum up, when we talk about postcolonialism and postmodernism, regardless of the boundaries within which they operate, regardless of the frameworks from which they emerge, it's important to notice that the desire in both postcolonial and postmodern frameworks is to bring the marginal to the center. It is this transformation, it is this move from the marginal towards the center is what becomes interesting when we talk about both of these concepts. So, what do they essentially do in order to make this possible, in order to make this move from the marginal towards the center? To quote Jean Edward Waite, postmodernists bring the marginal to the center by rewriting in favor of those who have been excluded from power, such as women, homosexuals, blacks, Native Americans and other victims of oppression. So, the key words over here are the move from the marginal to the center, the act of rewriting, and how there is a way in which one can focus focus on the categories who were otherwise excluded, and there is a list of these marginalized excluded ones which are being given. And Helen Tiffin, one of the postcolonial theorists, she writes, the postcolonial writers adopt the positions of those already written out of marginalized by the Western record of historical materialism, oppressed or annihilated peoples and women. So, there are certain common ideas that we can see over here. While the postmodernists focus on the act of rewriting in favor of those who have been excluded, the post-colonial writers do pretty much the same. They adopt positions of those who are already written out, and that also includes the same set of people such as the marginalized people and women. So, this sort of a corollary that we can identify, the sort of a confluence that we can identify in what the postmodernist and the postcolonial writers do, also brings us to another intersection of the postcolonial and the postmodern moment, in the words of Cameron Richards. Put another way, postcolonialism, like postmodernism and modernism, functions in terms of sexual, racial, class and economic and even stylistic differences, and are reducible to the spatial metaphor of a center margins opposition. So, these are also some of the terms that we had been visiting and revisiting in the course of our discussions related to postmodernism. We spoke about differences, we spoke about how the center margin dichotomy, the center margin binary needs to be thrown out in order to talk about postmodern theories and frameworks. In terms of difference and opposition, and also when we reject these binaries, it becomes possible to identify the places where postmodernism intersects with postcolonialism. As an example, we can also talk about some of the postcolonial writers who have delved deeper into the postcolonial themes by employing postmodernist ideas. So, here within the framework of a single novel, we can see that the postcolonial and the postmodern are not elements which are radically in opposition to each other, but they can also coexist. There can be a confluence of them, not just in theoretical terms, but also in the ways particular narratives are produced. For example, when we talk about these two novels, Crossing the River by Carol Phillips or In the Skin of a Lion by Michael Ondaatje, we begin to see that they deal with predominantly postcolonial themes, the characters, the setting, the plot, the conceptual ideas are all related predominantly to postcolonialism, but the narrative techniques which are being used could be seen as very pronouncedly postmodernist. And in this context, having said that there is a confluence between postcolonialism and postmodernism, it's also imperative to identify certain links and connectors which would also give us an outline to go through this discussion. And these terms and concepts have also been used extensively in our discussion of postmodernism. The first common aspect that one could identify is problematizing frontiers, secondly problematizing grounds, thirdly problematizing destinations, fourthly performativity, fifthly self-reflexivity, and finally repetitions of the same. When we talk about problematizing frontiers, we begin to see how postcolonialism and postmodernism are two similar forms of troubling the notion of identity. And we've already seen how postmodernism challenges the ideas of identity and how it also makes it possible to move away from the modernist and limiting conceptions of identity. While postmodernism deals with the failure of modernity, as we have already noted, postcolonialism deals with the failure of colonialism. And the similarities do not really end over there. Postcolonialism, just like postmodernism, it cannot maintain a distinction. And in this way, it begins to problematize the frontiers in such a way that it becomes impossible for postcolonial writers, for postcolonial theories to maintain a distinction between colonizers and colonized, and the distinction between center and periphery. And once we begin to do that, just like in postmodern theories, there is also a tendency to fall into a paradox. The idea of marking boundaries, the idea of having proper compartments for different concepts and for different kinds of identities is something that is inherently problematic in both postcolonialism as well as postmodernism. Just like postmodernism, postcolonialism is also based on problematizing grounds. And these grounds could be the grounds of all kinds of exclusions and inclusions and how they operate. It could include notions such as the foundations, origin, beginning, and we've already seen how historically these have become impossible elements when we talk about postmodernism. And this was also one of the major complaints that the Marxist critics raised against postmodernism, that there are no grounds on the basis of which one could make a judgment. There are no grounds on the basis of which one could very legitimately and effectively historicize. And just like the grounds of the grand narratives of Western modernity were problematized by the postmodernists, or in postcolonialism, we begin to see a different kind of problematization of grounds happening. Because Orientalism can be identified with a wide range of cultural registers. This could include science, knowledge, art, culture, bureaucratic administration, and even trade. And Orientalism talks about, postcolonialism talks about moving away from the ways in which these set of narratives that serve to support and maintain the Western Orientalist views have been considered as grand narratives. So just like postmodernism moves away from the grand narrative of Western modernity, postcolonialism moves away from the grand narrative of the Western colonial and Orientalist impulses. Here, the grounds or the basis for the formulation of the ideas of modernity or the Orientalist views have been extremely problematized to the extent that they even begin to challenge and reject these dominant views. Postmodernists began to argue that there is no teleological fulfillment of the project of modernity that one could identify, and from that rejection began the ideas of postmodernism. In the same way, there is a problematizing of destinations which happen with postcolonial, with the postcolonial moment as well. There is no teleological fulfillment of the projects of colonization that one could identify. It problematizes not just the notion of home, but it also talks about the widespread phenomenon of migration, transmigration, the figure of the refugee, the diverse ways of global diaspora. And here we find not just the notion of origin, but also the origin of, but also the notion of destination getting challenged and problematized. Postcolonialism also leads us into being convinced that one cannot make any coherent sense of the world based on these notions, these grand narratives related to origin and destination, which were also offshoot of certain colonial projects. This also takes us to the next idea of performativity, and this is something we've already noticed in the discussions of postmodernism, particularly with the influx of the feminist movement. And performativity can be defined as that aspect of a text or institution that can be revealed at the level of its functioning or acting. It is institution in act. So the focus is on the roles that one performs and not on the kind of definitions or meanings which are inherent. In Homi Bhabha's words, the terms of cultural engagement, whether antagonistic or affiliative, are produced performatively. To further problematize this notion of performativity, which we find both in postmodernism and postcolonialism, one of Homi Bhabha's remarks would be extremely useful, where he talks about postmodernism and identity. It is one of the ironic signs of our times that then introduction to the real me, postmodernism and the question of identity, that's a book published by Homi Bhabha. It should be written by an anglicized post-colonial migrant who happens to be a slightly Frenchified literary critic. That's a description that he uses to talk about himself. For in that hybridity of histories and the cultures, you have the spectacle of the simulacra, the corrosive craft of colonial mimicry exposing the limits of and borders of the sustaining project of Western mimesis. So here he talks about how identity can be located only at the level of performance, just like gender performativity operated in the words of Judith Butler. It becomes impossible to locate an identity which is away from any kind of performance. So post-colonialism, like postmodernism, draws our attention to the various aspects of performativity and how they constitute certain, how they constitute identity and the making of identity. This brings us to the next element, self-reflexivity, which is a very, very postmodern idea. And interestingly, we find the self-reflexivity of the postmodern in the postcolonial as well. So this constitutes a doubling of the self-awareness, which is the awareness of modernity's own doubling of identity in the empty repetition of cultural science. And here we are also introduced to certain words such as a hybridity, where the hybrid is explicitly focused upon, performed and inscribed in its performance. So we find that the idea of performativity goes hand in hand with the idea of self-reflexivity, just like it happens in the case of a number of postmodern instances. And we come to the final aspect, repetitions of the same. In the discussions related to postmodernism, we have already noticed that it becomes difficult to talk about good and bad postmodernisms because there are no paradigms, there are no grounds on which we could make such an evaluation or a judgment. So postcolonialism, just like postmodernism, it alerts us to the danger of repeating the traditional forms of hierarchy and superiority unless it could assume a solidarity with the alienated or the marginalized. So one of the ways in which we can tie up all of these discussions in the context of postmodernism and postcolonialism is the ways in which they reject the traditional forms of hierarchy and the ways in which they also warn themselves, they alert themselves to not repeat the same sort of hierarchical binaries. And on the contrary, instead of focusing again on those binaries and hierarchies which put in place certain kinds of superiority or inferiority, the focus is on the affirmation of repetition and difference. And the identity which gets formed through difference and through opposition is something that postmodernists also focus upon. And post-colonialists, in the same way, they talk about sampling, citing, quoting and simulating existence with no origin, or with origin already in representation with no identity, but what emerges out of repetition and difference. Most of these elements were also part of the discussions related to postmodernism, and here we begin to see how the post-colonial moment could be located even within the discussions related to postmodernism. So, when we talk about the elements of postmodernism in post-colonialism, we can identify again a few more particular aspects, the ways in which post-colonialism tries to revisit history or question the colonizer's representation of truth, rejects the meta-narratives of colonialism, and produces a text which challenge the origins of genres, canons and critical works. It could be seen as a very, very postmodern impulses within post-colonialism. And it's also important to underscore the fact that just like postmodernism, postcolonialism also has an impact on literary studies, which is also transdisciplinary in nature. And postcolonialism also celebrates marginal groups. They also dissolve the language of power through the various interventions. And like postmodernism, postcolonialism is also interested and fascinated with the subversive strategies which they use as part of narrative techniques as well, such as mimicry, parody and irony. And these forms of subversive techniques, subversive strategies are also used to deconstruct the meta-narratives. In the case of postmodernism, it's a meta-narrative of modernity, and in the case of postcolonialism, it's the meta-narrative of colonialism. And by using these very postmodern strategies and techniques, postcolonialism also strives for a new postcolonial meta-narrative of modernity itself. So, there are these various convergences which become interesting in this discussion of postcolonialism and postmodernism. So, in the next class, where we shall be taking these discussion forward with an emphasis on particular works, we shall be focusing particularly on Homi Bhabha's The Postcolonial and Postmodern, The Question of Agency, an excerpt from his seminal work, The Location of Culture. And Kwame Anthony Appiah's Is the Post and the Postmodernism, The Post and Postcolonial, an essay published in the journal Critical Inquiry in 1991. And also Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, an essay originally published in 1984 and revised in 1985 and 88 and 89. We shall be looking at how these works together, Bhabha's, Appiah's and Spivak's works together, they inform us of the ways in which the post-colonial operates in the contemporary within the postmodern scenario, and also focusing on the various paradigms from which they operate. In case of Gayatri Spivak, it is gender. In case of Kwame Anthony Appiah, it is the particularities of the theoretical frameworks used from within the African literary and artistic context. And in Homi Bhabha, it's a general theorization of the frameworks which are being used in the contemporary to talk about both the post-colonial and the postmodern. Alongside the discussion of these words, we will also be talking about certain other seminal fictional and non-fictional and literary and artistic texts which have also provided a ground for bringing together these discussions. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.